I'm going to introduce our first speaker and presenter of the day, Dr. Manuel Román Lacayo, from the Center of Latin American Studies here within the University Center for International Studies. Dr. Román Lacayo is a University of Pittsburgh alumnus who earned a Center for Latin American Studies certificate and a PhD in anthropology as a Heinz Fellow in Latin American Archaeology at the University of Pittsburgh. He was awarded a Fulbright Research Fellowship upon graduating from Harvard University in 1996 and was later appointed director of the National Museum of Nicaragua. After leaving Pittsburgh in 2006, Dr. Román Lacayo served as a country program manager and as the monitoring and evaluation manager for USA public-private partnerships in Nicaragua and Guatemala, while also working at the Universidad Americana in Managua, where he founded and coordinated the master's program in Latin American Studies. As the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American Studies, Dr. Román Lacayo manages the Center for Latin American Studies team, works with the affiliated faculty and staff, and spearheads development to raise the funds for the Center for Latin American Studies programming and research. And without further ado, I would like to turn the table and virtual microphone over to Dr. Román Lacayo. Thank you so much.
Zita. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be sharing my PowerPoint presentation or my screen with you all. But first of all, I want to say how grateful I am to be among you. I am privileged to be the first presenter, and I hope that if nothing else, I set a bar that can only be exceeded. So that shouldn't be too hard for me to have the lowest bar setting. Not that you shouldn't have great expectations, but it's a way to tell you that if you think that what we are going to embark upon in the next 35, 40 minutes is good, I can promise you it will only get better after that. So here is the presentation. I hope you can all see it. If you can't, please let me know or let Zita know. You can use the chat function for communicating with individuals or with everybody. And at any time, feel free to drop questions or remarks or observations or requests in the chat as well throughout the presentation. So Zita gave you one version of who I'm supposed to be, right? This is a way of thinking about the person who is before you. Well, there's a bunch of us in front of you because we are in virtual mode, but the person who is currently speaking to you, has been introduced. So you now have a context or an expectation about who I am, who this person is, that will be taking up or trying to keep your attention for the next half hour to 40 minutes or so. And this is a topic that has always been important and maybe more important for some of us than for others, because it's more obvious for some of us than it is for others. And over time, different things take up your attention. And if you have enough experiences, you also are generally fortunate enough to have the time to look back and reflect upon those experiences and think about how sharing what you learned from that reflection might make for better context or for better opportunities. And for those of us who are interested in education at all, this is always, it's a constant search for ways of teaching, of modeling, of projecting, of learning as well. This is, I've titled this presentation, "What's in a Name?" And it's based on a conversation that I had with one of my colleagues at the Center for Latin American Studies 2-3 years ago, when we were talking about this new feature that is included in our signatures, or can be included in our signatures at Pitt. And it's a feature that actually has, tells you why we have pronouns after our names, what our name may mean, how to pronounce it. There's a recording of in our own voice of how we pronounce our names, which is very nice. It's, common courtesy, maybe not so common, but it is a courteous way of approaching the people who are signing or sending you communications via email, right? And so it's also a way for that person to claim their own name. But we thought, all right, so it's nice to go through the mechanics of pronouncing somebody's name properly, right? It's respectful. It shows awareness of that person. But, it got us thinking, and it got me thinking even deeper about names. And so, in a sense, if you think about what my name is, and you saw it briefly or you can probably see it in the schedule. You probably can see it in under my picture on the screen. And if you were just point blank, just to look at that name and not having seen my face, what would you assume? What could you tell about my name from those words, from those letters that are linked together in this Roman alphabet characters, right? What would you assume? Especially, let's think about it in the US context, even though we are thinking globally here. But let's center it right now in the US context, although it does play out, wherever I've been, wherever I've traveled, where I've worked, in various continents across the world, not Australia or Antarctica, but pretty much anywhere else that I've been around the world, this plays out. And so from my name, what could you tell about who I am, right? And because it's Manuel, and because it's a compound last name, you might assume I'm either a first generation immigrant to the US or second generation or some combination thereof. What I've gotten when I've done this presentation in the past is, probably Spanish background, because we're in the American continent, you probably are Latin American. And I don't know if you can see enough, depending on your display, but after my name, I always like to be respectful and also indicate the pronouns that I like to be addressed by. And that's in deference to people for whom the more traditional way of addressing via pronouns doesn't fully represent who they are, right? It's also a way of saying, I see you, or I'm trying to see you, or I can contemplate seeing you, and I'm trying very hard to be welcoming and accommodating, and showing you that this is not going to be an issue when we address each other. So, the other thing is, if like most of us, we tend to have families, if not necessarily in direct genetic links, we have families in terms of generational and upbringing, in terms of roles. And so I am a father. I am also a son. I'm a cousin. I'm a grandson. I'm a husband. I have any number of different aspects of my identity that may or may not be immediately evident from my name, right? But they do come to play a role because after all, in this, at least when we grow up in this part of the world, we generally are given a name sometimes before we're born, but officially upon birth or very soon thereafter. And that name tends to, unless, you know, any number of other circumstances or challenges, issues, identity, you know, aspects that were not maybe readily evident upon birth, you know, they come to play. But in general, in the sort of Western European influence tradition, which is not to say that Native American or First Peoples traditions are similar in this continent, but in that tradition, you know, we tend to think about names in the context of previous generations, and sometimes we inherit those, right? And you might notice and you might recognize my little Starbucks label that I put there, which is it in this part of the world anyway. The Starbucks started requesting your name and writing it on the cup a few years back, probably a decade or so, if I recall correctly, somewhere thereabouts. And now they print it, so it's whatever. But at least they, you know, they call out your name, and you might think, Manuel, you know, it's, you know, just a few letters. It's 6 letters. It's got 3 vowels, 3 consonants in the Roman alphabet, and you know, it's still difficult for people to understand and to pronounce, despite the large number of people with Hispanic names, people of Latinx backgrounds that might have more familiarity with it as a growing population in this country. It's still, you know, Manuel is more challenging than you would think. And one of the things that I started doing, because I traveled so much for work in the past, before I came to the university, you know, I had a lot of airport Starbucks and then, you know, I have a double espresso pretty much every time I'm near a Starbucks. So with this new compulsion from the company to try and identify you as a person, came a whole bunch of interesting, you know, challenges in terms of how my name is actually spelled or pronounced, right? I love Monroe because that's when I moved to Boston in 1983, and I lived there for 13 years. That was the most common way that people would call me. When they would hear Manuel, and they would think, oh, it's Monroe. It's not Manuel. But that didn't happen in Pittsburgh until relatively recently, which is really, I find really interesting. You know, there's a whole other set of ways to think about that and to reflect upon that. But suffice it to say that my name is a challenge for some people. And especially, you know, I used to live in Washington, D.C. and travel out of Dulles International Airport. And needless to say, the DC area is filled with all sorts of relatively recent immigrant communities from all over the world. And it's fantastic. It's amazing. And also created all sorts of new ways that I hadn't seen of spelling my name. But, you know, let me just right now make a short parenthesis as well. That what I'm telling you about myself is not, and you know, it might seem like some sort of way of denying something I'm doing, but in fact, what I'm hoping that this does is that it prompts, it starts a reflection on your end about your name and about the people who you come in contact with whether they're new in your life or not new in your life, about their names and what that might say. So please think about this in the context, in the larger context than just this guy who's talking to you. My name is Manuel Antonio Román Lacayo. And now maybe if you've seen The Princess Bride, maybe I sound a little bit like, Inigo Montoya, but it's Manuel Antonio Román Lacayo. And I was given that name by my parents. Also, please, whatever you do, don't be too crafty with my name and try and get a lot of personal information, because you will be able to with all of this background that I'll give you. So there's that risk, but I'm trusting everybody is going to be good. So Manuel is a relatively common name all over Latin America and in Spain and even in Portugal, right? So in both the Hispanic and Lusophone tradition, Manuel is actually not an uncommon name. It's not as popular as it once was, but it's still commonly found throughout. And it really does come from Hebrew, right? From Emmanuel. And of course, there's also phonetic ways of representing that name, but you can find that version, Emmanuel or Emmanuel or Emmanuel, or whether it's in the Basque, or you can find it all over the places in the world where Portuguese, Spanish, French, German people either colonized or landed, right? And it, from what I've read and what I've been told, it means the Lord is among us. So it's a name that reminds everybody that there is a God on the one hand, but that this God is all around us, and that maybe it's a cause for celebration. So Emmanuel, from the Hebrew, right? Antonio, I get, and by the way, also Manuel, I get from other generations in my father's family, which is Román. Román is the paternal last name, the paternal family name. And there are a number of generations where Manuel existed with Román as the last name. And for some reason in Chile, there's a good bunch of them. All over the US, there's a bunch of them. And I've even had some really funny run-ins about that, especially when I lived in Boston, because they thought there was only one, but there were a number already in Boston when I lived there. And so Antonio is also, a family name, mostly from the Lacayo side. So Lacayo is my mother's family name. But remember, this is not necessarily a reason for saying, oh, how wonderful maternal family names are kept. It's actually my mother's father's name. So my mother's name, is not memorialized, and that's generation after generation. Because we tend to live we live in a tradition that culturally prioritizes the male bloodline. So Antonio is ostensibly the reason why that name was chosen is because of the saints. There's either Antonio de Padua, the Portuguese saint who was all about interpreting biblical text, etc., like a scholar, right? Or Antonio the Great, who is like the father of all monks, or the patron saint, I guess, of monks, because he lived a monastic life. So in either case, if you think about those and you put those together, there's a lot of religion already involved in my name, right? And just the first and last name. Román is, as I said, my paternal family name, and we're not really certain where it comes from. There's all sorts of ways that it could come from Russia or Romania. It could be a Romani name, which, for people who have migrated all through Europe, who still are not looked upon with great favor. And in Europe, even nowadays, lots of issues about acceptance of the Romani. Or it could be San Roman, which is a name that was adopted by Sephardic Jews in Spain during the Inquisition. So they would take off their original last name or family name to avoid being persecuted or tortured or killed or whatever, and they put in San Roman. So we're not really certain in my family where it comes from, and in some ways it would be wonderful. I'm an archaeologist. I like to look at the past, but I haven't delved into it with any sort of depth. And Lacayo is as I also said, my maternal family's name. And Lacayo, if you translate it to English, means lackey, means somebody who serves the noble, right? Which is not necessarily if you want to be proud of a name, you're a proud servant, I guess, which is interesting. But it's not also in the country where my parents were born, because I was born here in the US. And though I've lived in Nicaragua and I love the country, and I married a Nicaraguan woman, and one of my kids even was born over there. Even with that, in Nicaragua, Lacayo is actually a name that conveys a certain amount of power and influence. And as I look back, when I would teach classes about Nicaraguan colonial history, I found an ancestor with this last name, the first one, the earliest that I could find, but in the history books, not necessarily genealogy, but in the history books, who actually made a great fortune from coffee, planting coffee around this prominent mountain in the south central part of the Pacific of Nicaragua, and near the Great Lakes. So if you ever look at a map of Nicaragua, there's two big lakes. The bigger one is the one that this ancestor lived around and near. And the really sad thing about that is that the reason why he was able to make all this great fortune out of this land, because he was granted the right to dispossess the indigenous communities who lived there, and was also able to, or given the authority to basically become slaves. They became indentured. They had to live on his land that used to be their land, but it was his land now. So these people worked for free, living on their previous land, and made this ancestor a great fortune. So, when you might have thought about my name in the abstract, consider that every part of this, as in, this is just a scratch in the surface, right, of what each name could mean and all the concepts, but all of that is in me, right? Because I've actually thought about it, I've actually looked at it. I've had family with whom I've exchanged and talked about for decades about any number of things. So the context from which my name comes, there's some pride, there's some shame, right? There's some aspects that are of interest. There's some aspects that just seem random and maybe, not of much relevance for now, anyway. And then, the question is, as you think about your names, whether you carry your mother's maiden name, whether like in the Lusophone tradition, the mother's maiden name is of the two last names would be the first of the two last names. And in the Spanish, it's the other way around, the fathers. Um, you know, so why do I carry all these names? And even a last name that is may not even be what the original family name was. But it all comes, especially with somebody, who likes to think about and talk about these things with people and reflect upon it. What does that say about me? And so when you see me and I talk to you, and hopefully you're still connected and thinking about this, and maybe even paying attention in a way that I've engaged you in, when you put that together with the introduction that Zita created for us, for me in this instance, how does that set me? How do you see me the same or differently? How do you understand me in a way that maybe when you just saw my name in the abstract, and before you looked at any description, or before you might have even looked me up to see who it is that will be opening the week's worth of work for you, how has that changed? And I should also say that though I did become an archaeologist, my first impulse as an undergrad was to become a teacher. And I always loved the whole idea of constructivism, right? And as I'm talking to instructors and teachers and people who lead in this area, what I'm hoping is that by me having talked about this in this way, that I'm not giving you the answers, and I'm not telling you what to do about it, and I'm not thinking that you will necessarily model me, but hopefully I'm creating some weight of information, some data that is actually adding to the way you think about your students when you see them, when you see their names, whether they're easy, straightforward, whether they're complicated or hard for us to pronounce, for me to pronounce, or to understand what they actually might mean, or they might actually, have all sorts of meanings. There are people in this continent whose names are quite literal about the first sort of the flashes of behavior or interest or personality that the young person showed, and so then they become sort of their name actually doesn't get set until later in their lives. And with a lot, especially in this country, with a lot of the issues that have to do with people feeling like they're being seen, right? Beyond the common courtesy of trying to recognize them for who they are. Also, we might have some memories about our time as in school, as youth, maybe in our family or among our family and extended family, in terms of the jokes that might have been made about our names, the rhymes, the perhaps the bullying that took place, or the ways that we felt inside of a group or outside of a group because of our name, the way we might have wanted our name to be rather than what it was, right? And I went through all of that because this name of mine is not, especially in its full expression, is not so common in this country even now. And where the tradition has been more for a lot of English sounding first names with generally European last names to be the dominant expression in this country. And as I said, that's changing. As a kid growing up and trying to adapt and trying to fit in, or not trying to fit in, right? My name could be an asset, but it could also be problematic. And it's in that way that, I want you I would like for this presentation to spur some thought. You know, I have famous relatives. If you ever look at my name, you'll find a former president of Nicaragua. You'll find prime minister who was actually my uncle. The other guy is my great uncle. You know, there's this storied line, right? And so in Nicaragua, when you said my name, there might be different associations than when you come here. So in a sense, I'm somebody just for my name, not having accomplished anything, just from having inherited these names. I'm somebody who's seen, even if I had no family relation, I would be associated with these well-known people. But once you change, you know, when you move around, when names are not as common in different places around this country or around the world, when you think about your students, you know, and then you think about who they are, you know, those photos that you'll see in the presentation are actually, my kids are no longer that small, but I just thought that, I just love that photo. Andres Santiago is the little guy with the number 7 Steelers jersey, very proudly Steelers fans. He carries my father's middle name. My oldest, number 30 over here, number 30 no longer plays for the Steelers, by the way. Well, actually, not one of them, 2 retired Steelers. And there you know something else about me. But Eduardo is named after my father. So they're both named after my father in some way, right? And I'm named after my grandfather, who had the exact name. So I'm Manuel Antonio. I also have a cousin whose name is Eduardo, Román. And my father at one point was a prominent guy in the country. And so you have all these associations, and so you carry these traditions because you're proud of them, perhaps, or because you want to honor your ancestors. And there was a time when I was Manuel, right? That guy with the electric bass in the middle, Dungy Club in Boston. And I wanted to, in fact, forget these ancestors and these family members. I wanted to be known for something else. I did not want to stick out, and I wanted to sort of be ironic about how my name, and actually that's a good phonetic pronunciation of my name, Manuel. And that seemed to stick in Boston because I didn't like being called Monroe, because I didn't have a good association with the president, Monroe. So it, you know, when you look at those 4 words that were my name before I started talking to you, and when you think about all I've told you, you know a heck of a lot more about all of that with me than some people I've worked with for years, right? With people that I've known for maybe even longer, who never questioned any of these aspects about me in terms of my name. This is stuff that I think about. And this is certainly stuff that I think a lot of us think about in terms of our identity. Who are we? And especially when you're in a place where few people know you, the beginning of a school year, when you're in a new school, when you're transitioning from, you know, elementary to middle school or to high school, you know, the different sizes. And when you have new people coming into the school systems year after year, and you think about the impact, you know, that your name actually might have on those that you meet anew, but also the way those that you meet anew, how they think about you. And so I think that this whole concept of what is your name, what is in a name, since it goes right to the root of you, it, you know, beyond what I told you about that application that we have at Pitt for our signature, allows people who might be curious to learn how to pronounce the name, maybe even learn a little bit about that person's name. Um, you know, that it goes to our core, and it connects to essentially anything in terms of human relations. Of course, I'm thinking as an anthropologist, and but also in terms of legacy, as the archaeologist, but also in terms of the way you set off, the way you start a relationship, a learning and teaching relationship, the collective experience in the classroom, the way you meet people around the world, the way you consider what, how everybody, every student, every potential topic comes fraught and condensed with all of this meaning that we tend to, sort of brush aside, or that people, as I did in my aspiring musical career, I never really went very far, that don't want to be, that want to fit in, that people will change their name to make it easier for everybody around them to pronounce, rather than expecting people to see them for who they are and who they've been and where they come from. And I think that to the extent that we can encourage people to be who they are and who they've been, regardless of where they are, I think that is just a great starting point for any international, for any local, for any interpersonal learning. I think it's about respect. It's about appreciating the person in front of you. It's about recognition, but it's also about, what does it mean to you? Do you have a nickname? I had a couple of nicknames. None of them were mean. They were fun and affectionate. But I grew out of the nicknames, except when I'm still around my father, who, unfortunately, he's got Alzheimer's, so he doesn't recall much of anything anymore. But some of my cousins, aunts and uncles who remember me as that little kid that had that nickname, right? And I was fortunate not to have a name that people picked and made fun of, right? That I didn't like. But I do have friends and relatives who have, and that can be horrible, right? This whole idea about the controversy of the pronouns. To the extent that you can claim your own identity, I think anybody should have the right to. And to the extent that we can be tolerant and courteous and considerate, we should try and respect that. But that's how I see it, right? It's just, in a sense, a basic topic, because what I'm telling you, I think, works at the local level, but especially when you think about crossing international lines, when people come from completely different traditions that you may or may not be familiar with, people who's, have friends who are named after the day they were born, because everybody in their country, or actually in that cultural tradition, part of Nigeria, that's how people get named, right? When you're born on a Monday, you're called Monday. And if you're from other places, you might be a flower, you might be this hopeful symbol. Our names in this part of the world have become so abstract that they don't really seem to mean anything, but they once did, right? And so all those images that have become just this abstract record-keeping device, but really, in the end, it's about us being seen for who we are, or trying to be seen for who we want to be in front of others, whether that is who we are right now in front of others, or that's something that we aspire to be in front of others, or something that we maybe were, right, and are no longer. So I hope that I haven't discourage you from this by just talking so much about myself. And I would, I know that we're not, with a lot of ample time, but if you have any comments or questions, we have about 4 minutes, and I would love to entertain them. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
I'd like to encourage our teachers and participants to ask any questions, or if you would like to share something about your name, your self, that you think would really be important for the rest of us to know about you, that'd be great and wonderful too.
Zita, and I
And
see
in
a
the
question
meantime-
from I see a question from Jackie,
Yep.
and it's about my mom's full name. And my mom is from that generation where she took on my dad's name. And though they separated and divorced, and then they got married again, even throughout, she kept the same surname, basically my dad's. So it's really interesting because I keep my mom's, but she didn't necessarily. She is known as Lacayo de Román, belonging to Román.